For me, a comic really becomes a comic when you put two panels right next to each other. By doing this simple task, you're asking the reader to create closure between your two distinct moments. Closure is the thing our brain does when it needs to fill in the gaps in a flow of information. Sometimes it's easy for our brains to create closure, but when it comes to comics and other forms of visual art, closure requires a bit more from our imagination. For example, try and imagine what's happening between these two panels. All of our brains are going to come up with something different. And it's not the job of the cartoonist to fill in all the gaps in a story. In fact, it's the gaps between bits of information that allow the reader to use their imagination and gives the reader the chance to engage with the storytelling. The comic artist tells their story through closure created by the transition from panel to panel. And there are 7 distinct types of transitions. We define them by the sense of closure they offer the reader. Now let's use Edith in her big exam to see just how these 7 types of transitions impact the storytelling. The most common types of comic transitions are based on a really familiar concept, the passage of time. The first transition we'll look at is called a moment-to-moment transition. A moment-to-moment transition is pretty easy to recognize. They often have very similar styles of framing and only slight variations between the two panels. Let's say we want to show Edith is terrified to mark the wrong answer on her test. We can draw her in 2 panels with only slight variations in her hand and increasing little subtle things like the stress in her eyes. The clock can tell us how much time has literally passed, but the images show us what the passage of time feels like to Edith. An action-to-action transition is probably the most common type of transition. It distinguishes itself by presenting a clear beginning and an end to an interaction between a character and something else. Edith sits down to take the test in panel 1. In panel 2, we see her exhausted at the end of it. I like to think of action to action as completing a small character arc inside a much bigger story. In this transition, we see Edith go from intent all the way to exhausted. A subject-to-subject transition is how a comic shows a character's interaction with another subject in the scene. It's most common when we see a character interacting or responding to something. Here, Edith responds to the teacher's declaration that time is, in fact, up. Maybe you've heard actors say that acting is really reacting. Personally, I think of my comic characters as the actors in my story, and a subject-to-subject transition is a great opportunity to teach the reader about the character. A scene-to-scene transition connects 2 locations to one another. It's time-based, though an understanding of the length of time is not crucial. This style of transition is often used to bring us from one part of a character's story to the next. In this case, we're showing Edith flunking her test, and then we jump to her back at home eating dinner. This transition shows us that the experience of the test has made poor Edith lose her appetite, and it's also a good way to open up the story for new interactions with other characters. An aspect-to-aspect transition doesn't represent passage of time like the previous 3 transitions we've looked at. While we're seeing multiple subjects in these panels, we're not using this transition to push the story forward. We're simply introducing the reader to a space and giving them the sense of what it feels like to be there. Aspect-to-aspect transitions are often most effective when reflecting a character's point of view. And I don't necessarily mean looking directly through their eyes. This transition is intended to give the reader a sense of how Edith feels trapped by the test and the limits of time on it. An aspect-to-aspect transition can, without words, really set the tone for the upcoming story. A symbolic transition is even more abstract. It's using a panel within a comic's established world and juxtaposing it with an image that suggests a particular type of association. Basically, this is how comics do metaphor. For example, we can show panel 1 of Edith being handed a test, and in the next panel, we see her head explode. The explosion is not intended to be literal. It's just a suggestive way of relaying Edith's experience and feeling from panel 1. This transition is basically saying, as Edith looked at the exam questions, her head felt like it would explode. A symbolic transition requires more participation from the reader because they need to take the moment in and interpret the meaning of the second panel and how it relates to the first. Now you can take symbolism even further with a transition like this. Panel 1 shows an image of Edith taking her test. Panel 2 shows an antelope being chased by a lion. Now the goal here is to compare Edith's experience to the antelope's experience. Now here's the thing, taking the reader out of the setting of the story is a pretty risky move. It can be really engaging for someone who appreciates an unconventional narrative, but also kind of alienating for someone who doesn't have a lot of experience with comic art and storytelling. Whenever you're planning a transition, you want to think about how it affects the flow of the story. Every transition style has its strengths, but no single type can tell a complete story. That is to say, every comic artist uses their own blend of transition types to build their narratives. In the next chapter, we'll look at a couple examples.